So here's where we are. Essentially, you are looking at metaphoric criticism, and we're going to do this in two parts. One, we're going to define a metaphor, and two, we're going to talk about how you use metaphor in terms of doing rhetorical criticism. So let's open with part one here, define metaphor. All right. Essentially, when we start talking about a metaphor, we're talking about a comparison where ideas are brought together so that the sort of stuff we would associate with one of those things is carried over, and that's literally what the word metaphor means in Greek. It means to carry over. So the ideas that are associated with one thing, those ideas, those qualities get carried over to something else. And if you look carefully, you'll see that those are the three parts of the metaphor there. Okay, the three parts of the metaphor are the stuff that's going to get associated, and then the one thing and the other thing. All right. So we have names for those. If you don't know them, let's learn those names. The tenor is the thing that we're talking about. It's the one that's going to actually get the quality from the other thing. So when we say, when we say a metaphor is a magic door, metaphor is the tenor. Literally, the word metaphor in that sentence is the tenor. The thing that is going to lend some assistance is called the vehicle, in this case, magic door. And the ground is that quality that's getting associated. A magic door sort of opens new vistas, new horizons, new ways of seeing and associating things. So that's essentially the basics. We're going to take a look at a couple of examples here. So when we start off with something like Randolph is a pig, okay? So we all know real quickly that Randolph is probably not a literal pig because we're talking about metaphors, right? So when we talk about Randolph is a pig, Randolph is the tenor. That's the one who will be receiving what the vehicle is carrying. Okay, so the vehicle is carrying certain qualities over to Randolph. Pig, in this case, is the vehicle. So when we say Randolph is a pig, we need to know those terms. We need to know that Randolph is the tenor of the metaphor and pig is the vehicle of the metaphor. All right. Which brings us to the question of, okay, so what's the ground in this case? Well, it's not complicated, right? We're talking about a pig. Randolph is a pig. We mean Randolph is some kind of messy guy, right? That's the point. So the quality, the ground that's being carried over and dumped on Randolph, if you want to think about it that way, the vehicle carries some ground and dumps it onto Randolph, okay, onto the tenor. That's how metaphors work. So when we come here, and we have this vehicle, pig. There's our pig right there. Sweet little piggy. Piggy is carrying something over to our tenor, Randolph. Here's Randolph up here too, right? That's Randolph. Well, actually, that's Jean Piaget, but we won't worry about it. This is Randolph. The pig is carrying the idea of being messy over and dumping it on our tenor, Randolph. So there's Randolph. He's as messy as a pig. That's how a metaphor fundamentally works. And it's these qualities, the vehicle, the tenor, and the ground, that make it functional. And that you as a critic, those are the three parts of the metaphor. There are other parts of metaphors if you want to go deep, but those are the three parts of a metaphor that you're going to need if you were to choose metaphoric criticism to write your essay 2 on. All right, so there they are. Those are the parts. That's basically how they function. Very straightforward, and you've been doing this your whole life, so it's not going to be anything right new and surprising. All right, you have seen this before. If we want to take a moment and just sort of work out the tenor and the vehicle a little bit more clearly, the tenor is the reality that you're making a point about. In our example there, it was Randolph. Okay, that's the reality that we are making a point about, and the vehicle is the thing that's not really there. It's the absent thing that's loaning some idea, giving some kind of quality, making some kind of a point, describing, as we say, carrying a quality over to the tenor. So our vehicle carries some kind of a quality over to our tenor. That's the basic function of the metaphor. So we can have a tenor like road, and we can have a vehicle, a ribbon of moonlight. if you make that association, bully for you. It's a line out of The Highwayman, a famous song. When we put those two things together, it's when we mush them up and you can't really make sense out of one without using the other. That's when you end up with a metaphor. Okay, so the metaphor is the crunching together of that idea of the tenor and the vehicle, bringing them into an association. And we bring them into that association basically by linking them up. And almost always we say, you know, it was, the road was a ribbon of moonlight over the purple moor. Okay, boom, there we are. That's a metaphor. We got it. All right. The road is our tenor. Ribbon of moonlight, that's our vehicle. That's something that's describing something else. Now, the question that remains is, okay, so where's our ground? Well, it's not hard to figure out. If you sit down and you work it through, there's our ground. That ribbon of moonlight, something that shimmers, something that's narrow. You don't get really, really wide ribbons, right? You don't get an 8-foot wide ribbon. We're talking about some little narrow, shimmering, kind of glowing something. Oh, road. That's what it is. It's a road. Okay, so it's that shimmering, that narrowness, that glowing. We pick that up from ribbon of moonlight. There it is right there. And those qualities that are brought to our mind by ribbon of moonlight, we bring over and we associate with the road. And that is what makes the metaphor powerful. The qualities of one thing, in this case, the vehicle, get associated in the quality, the ground of one thing, the vehicle, gets brought over and left with the tenor. So there is this moment where we are in our own mind tying it all together, making it happen. So it's one of the reasons metaphors are powerful, is that the audience is actually stitching together this metaphoric reality. They have to work along with you. They have to finish the statement that I'm speaking to you as if you were the rhetor at this point. But the artifact, that artifact that you're going to be working with, that artifact is going to require its audience to work with it in completing ideas and finishing thoughts and making associations. And it's a really powerful thing for a rhetorical artifact to be able to pull off. All right. Here's a slide, and we're not going to go through this because it's basically just the definitions we've been talking about in a very nice, quick, tight frame. All right, it's just going to highlight the vehicle and the tenor and the ground for you. So basically, when you pick this up and you look at this over on, there we are, and you look at this when you look at the slides, if you look at the slides later when we pick them up, this is just a nice slide that will sort of summarize everything up for that first part where we're trying to define the metaphors. All right. That's going to bring us to the second idea of, okay, so what do you do with that, right? How do you use metaphors in rhetorical criticism? And the short answer to that is it's really quite straightforward. Not surprisingly, the very first thing you are going to do is you're going to find the metaphors. So now, if we're doing this, if we're doing metaphoric criticism, you're going to pick your artifact. Obviously, you want to look for an artifact that has a bunch of metaphors in it, right, that are important and powerful. Or perhaps, as we'll talk about here in just a second, maybe you want to have an artifact where there is one single metaphor that runs through the entire artifact and defines it. That's a possibility too. But we're going to identify the metaphors. That's the first thing we're going to do. So find the metaphors. Now, if we're thinking in terms of our process of of describe the artifact, analyze the artifact, and then make a judgment based in your analysis. Okay, if you're doing metaphoric criticism, that describe the artifact is pretty much identical to what you have done in your classical description. Okay, when you're using your classical description for essay 1A and 1B, you describe the context, you describe the text. That's what you do when you're doing a metaphoric criticism. You do the same thing, but obviously when you describe the text, you want to gloss really quickly over its basic structure And you want to highlight the fact that there are lots of comparisons in here, because in the end, a metaphor is just a special kind of comparison. So you want to highlight that. And you want to pick out and identify the metaphors that are present in your artifact. That's your first step, really, of moving from description to analysis. When we talk about identifying the metaphors, it's straightforward. There's nothing mysterious here. You're going to note the three parts. Okay. Those parts we just talked about, you're going to call them out for each metaphor. Now, that ground is going to be where you're really going to have to spend a little bit of time. Okay. We want you to explain the grounds fairly carefully in metaphors, because those grounds, that's going to be the pay dirt when you turn your attention to interpretation and evaluation. All right. The second thing you do is you sort the metaphors. So those are your two steps. We're done. That's it. That's all you do. You identify the metaphors, note the parts, explain the grounds, especially, and you sort the metaphors. Now, when we talk about sorting metaphors, basically we mean we are looking for patterns that emerge. That should surely ring some bells for you if you've read your textbook. That's what we do in rhetorical criticism. We're all about finding patterns in a text that are going to sort of shepherd an audience along toward a conclusion. We look for groups of metaphors, types of metaphors, patterns in the way the metaphors are used. These are things that are really, really intriguing to us, and we put them together. When we find these groups, if we find groups and types, we like to pull them apart and group them, under these similarities or differences. Then we're going to have to explain the metaphors. Okay, so these are our two steps in analysis: identify the metaphor, note its parts, explain the grounds, sort the metaphors, group the metaphors in your message together in some way that helps clarify what's actually going on here. And then we start talking about explaining the metaphors themselves. Now, this is the part where I said, you're probably going to want to get a good drink and sit in a soft chair and think really, really hard for a long while, because that's what this does. When we explain the metaphors, we are basically highlighting how the structures that are present. By structures, we mean, those groups, those types, those patterns that we saw above. We want to explain how those structures might reasonably affect an audience. How would an audience, reasonably respond to those structures, those metaphors, the workings of the metaphors? Explain to us what you think the audience might do with that. As soon as we do that, if you're paying attention, you will note pretty quickly that we are moving from analysis into interpretation and evaluation. So metaphoric criticism is another one where that boundary between analysis and interpretation, it's real, it's still there. You're doing different tasks, but they look a lot alike. Well, no, they don't look a lot alike. Let me restate that. They bleed into each other, okay? It's like a watercolor. They just kind of wash into each other at this point. When you are, when you're sorting your metaphors and you're beginning to talk about how your metaphors might reasonably affect your audience, you're already setting interpretation and evaluation into your discussion. That's really basically what you do. That's the whole of the thing at this point. I'll just highlight a couple of other issues that you might run into here. All right. When you are thinking, we mentioned this in brief a moment ago, but when you're thinking about your artifact and you're going out to gather up your artifact, you're identifying metaphors. Well, there are two things that are of interest to a metaphoric critic who is out looking for an artifact. One is quantity. It may be that you are looking for an artifact, or you find an artifact that has many, many different kinds of metaphors in it. Okay, or simply many metaphors. Okay, if you find a text that's got a lot of metaphors, that's great, and that's one way to do good metaphoric criticism. A text that has many metaphors in it you can work with. However, there are also the kinds of messages that have what are called defining metaphors, or generalized metaphors, or universal metaphors. Don't get hung up on the terminology. All we mean by this is that the whole message is built around a single metaphor. In other words, the message itself is a metaphor, the whole thing. So you will get one famous example, of course, that everybody loves, everybody who's rhetorical, who does rhetorical criticism loves it. If you haven't done rhetorical criticism, you've probably never seen this particular commercial, but there's a political commercial, famous, made famous by Ronald Reagan back in the days when he was running for office, and he was accusing the person he was running for of being soft on communism. It's a very popular American theme, right? You don't hate the communists enough, okay? And Reagan released a commercial that was basically this man walking in the woods, and he was sort of the all-American man, the rough, independent guy out here walking through the woods, and the narrator, who has this rather imposing, threatening voice, it sounds like at any moment they're going to go whoo and scare you, right? The narrator says, what if you're out walking in the woods? You're told to be careful. And all this, we see this man walking through the wilderness here. There may be bears out there. And then he goes on and he talks about how the bears are dangerous. Now, maybe the narrator is going to tell you, maybe there's no bear around the next curve, but maybe there is a bear around the next curve. Wouldn't it be best if you were ready to meet a bear if there's a bear? Okay, and that's the commercial. It's the whole commercial. That's all it does. That's the whole thing, okay, is the guy walking through the woods and this narrator talking about how terrible it would be if he had to meet a bear. And if he has to meet a bear, it would be good if he was prepared. That's it. Okay, well, you don't have to be a rhetorical genius to figure out what's going on here, especially if you know, incidentally, the fact that under the old Soviet Empire, the bear was their national animal, like we have the bald eagle. Okay, so it's pretty clear what's happening here. And it's a statement that says you need to be prepared, and some people aren't going to make you prepared, and others of us, Reagan, is going to make you prepared. Okay, that stunning, fun commercial, or imposing commercial, it was one metaphor. That's all. It was just a metaphor beginning to end. Okay, well, there might have been a couple of different metaphors working in there, but overall, we could say that when we looked at it, we had one defining metaphor in that entire message. Okay, when you get something like that, you also have an artifact that's got a really solid, good punch to it if you want to go out and you want to do rhetorical criticism using this method. So that's essentially the things to look for when you begin to think about the artifact that you would work with if this were your method. Then in that case, you want to find an artifact that's going to give you a lot of metaphors to work with, or you want to find an artifact that is a metaphor. It just is from beginning to end. If you find an artifact that's got a lot of metaphors, the place most metaphorical critics are going to start is they're going to start with the vehicles, and they're going to look for similarities in vehicles. Now, that's not the only thing you can do, not by a long shot. There's a lot to be done here. But on the whole, look for similarities in vehicles. That's what will help you out. All right. So how do you do it? You get your text, you go through, you highlight all the metaphors, you figure out the parts, all three parts of every metaphor you can find. You explain the grounds. You write just a paragraph to yourself in your notes explaining the grounds of every single metaphor you've run across. Those are your basic notes, and that's where you start. Then you start sorting the metaphors. You look for groups or types, patterns. Now, patterns, when you're sorting the metaphors, the patterns that you can think about here might also be in relationship to other things we've talked about. So, for example, you might have a pattern where there's a problem solution, and the problem is all very, very much statistical and logos, and then solutions are full of metaphors, or vice versa, right? You might have a problem solution where you got tons of metaphors to explain the problem, But then we get to solutions and it's all like charts and graphs. Okay, that's helpful. That tells you something. We're thinking about those kinds of things in regard to patterns as well. But we're also thinking in terms of patterns, we're also thinking about those similarities in vehicles, or whether we have one particular tenor that has a number of vehicles applied from several different directions on it. So those are the kinds of patterns we're looking for. And then we come to this point where we start trying to explain those metaphors in terms of especially how those grounds are helping us, how they are reasonably affecting the audience. And when we do that, we're already slipping into interpretation and evaluation. And that's what we do in order to conduct the entire critical array. This is a quotation from Sonia K. Foss, who has herself, she's a brilliant scholar, has written zillions and zillions of books in our field. She's really worth reading as well. She's pretty clear, pretty straightforward. We teach out of Professor Foss's text, both at the undergraduate and graduate levels. So she's got a text that is written for undergraduates. She has one that's written for the graduate level. They're good books, really good books. So if you, whatever text, whatever method you are thinking about using, you might want to write this name down, because I bet you Sonia K. Foss has a chapter in one of her books that will explain that method very well, with incredible clarity and detail. So you might want to write that name down. No matter, I mean, whether you're doing metaphor criticism or any other criticism that we're talking about this year, she's a good name to have have on your reference list. All right. So this is her description at the end. She says, the critic suggests effects, and she means here especially effects on the audience, and how the metaphors function to argue for a particular attitude toward the ideas that are presented. A particular attitude, okay? Metaphors aren't going to give you a whole lot of data. That's not what they do. What they do is they shape and direct the audience's pathetic qualities, their pathos, their feelings, their emotions. They're designed to build emotional appeals. So think about metaphors in that kind of a term, because that's essentially what you're after. You're after setting up a sense in the audience of what matters here, what's important, what's valuable. It's all the value stuff, and it's all the hierarchy stuff about our feelings. That's what metaphors will tap into. All right, so there we are. That, in a nutshell, is the world of metaphoric criticism.